March 15th, 2019. A room full of elite cadets erupted in laughter when a grey-haired man in a torn, faded uniform walked into their morning assembly at Fort Bennet Military Academy. They whispered jokes about the old-timer who couldn't even afford a proper uniform, mocking every frayed seam and missing button as Colonel Harris stepped to the podium. But what was on that small, worn patch above his chest pocket that made every single cadet fall silent and drop to attention in respect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun barely broke through the thick clouds hanging over Fort Bennet Military Academy as Cadet Brandon Mitchell adjusted his perfectly pressed uniform in the mirror. Every crease was sharp, every button polished to a mirror shine. Around him, his fellow cadets moved through the barracks with the same meticulous attention to detail. This was the elite training program. After all, and only the top 1% of applicants made it through the doors. Formation in 10, called out Cadet Jessica Brennan from the hallway, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never failed an inspection. Brandon gave himself one last look, straightened his cap, and headed out with the others. The assembly hall buzzed with the usual pre-ceremony energy. 200 cadets stood in perfect rows, their uniforms identical, their postures rigid. This morning was special. They were told a distinguished guest would be addressing them, someone who would share insights about real military service. Brandon exchanged glances with his friend, Cadet Derek Thompson, who stood 2 rows back. Probably another desk general, Derek muttered under his breath, careful not to let the instructors hear. They always bring in these guys who spent their whole career in offices. Colonel Patricia Harris, the Academy's commanding officer, entered through the side door, her stride purposeful and commanding. Behind her walked a man who immediately drew stares, but not the respectful kind the cadets usually reserved for visiting officers. The man appeared to be in his late 60s, maybe early 70s. His hair had gone completely grey, cut short, but not in any military style the cadets recognized. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. But what really caught everyone's attention was his uniform. It was a disaster. The fabric looked like it had been through a war itself, faded from what might have once been a deep olive green to a washed-out, sun-bleached shade. The left sleeve had a tear near the shoulder that had been crudely stitched with thread that didn't even match. Several buttons were missing entirely, replaced with mismatched substitutes that looked like they'd been scavenged from different garments. The pants had visible wear marks at the knees, and his boots, while clean, were so worn that the leather had cracked in multiple places. A ripple of whispers spread through the formation. "Is this guy serious?" Brandon heard someone behind him hiss. Cadet Marcus Webb, standing in the front row, didn't even bother to hide his smirk. "Look at this clown," he whispered to the cadet beside him. Did he raid a thrift store? More snickers erupted, carefully concealed behind coughs and cleared throats. The cadets had spent years learning about military bearing, about the importance of presentation and appearance. This man represented everything they'd been taught to avoid: a complete lack of standards, a disregard for the uniform code, an embarrassment to everything the military stood for. Jessica leaned slightly toward her neighbor. "I've seen better uniforms at Halloween stores." The man seemed completely unaware of, or perhaps unbothered by, the mockery spreading through the ranks. He followed Colonel Harris to the front of the room, that slight limp never breaking his forward momentum. His face remained neutral, weathered, and lined in a way that suggested he'd spent considerable time outdoors, possibly in harsh conditions. Colonel Harris stepped up to the podium, and the room fell into the required silence, though the smirks remained on many faces. She surveyed her cadets with an expression that was harder to read than usual. "Cadets," she began, her voice cutting through the space like a blade. "You are the future of our armed forces. You represent the next generation of military leadership. You've been selected from thousands of applicants because you demonstrated excellence in academics, In physical fitness, in character assessments, the cadets stood straighter, pride evident in their bearing. This was familiar territory, the kind of praise they'd worked tirelessly to earn. But excellence, Colonel Harris continued, her tone shifting slightly, is not just about pressed uniforms and polished medals. It's not about looking the part for inspection or memorizing regulations from a handbook. Some of the smirks began to fade. Colonel Harris had a reputation for unexpected lessons. Excellence is forged in circumstances that most of you cannot yet imagine. It's tested in places where appearance becomes the last thing on your mind, where survival and mission completion are all that matter. She paused, letting her words sink in. Today, I've invited someone who can teach you more about true military service than any textbook or training exercise ever could. She gestured to the man in the torn uniform, who stepped forward with that same unhurried limp. Up close, under the harsh fluorescent lights of the assembly hall, the damage to his uniform was even more apparent. Brandon could now see what looked like old stains on the fabric, discolorations that hadn't come out despite what must have been numerous washings. "This is Sergeant Major William Kovach," Colonel Harris announced. The name meant nothing to most of the cadets. A few shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that their earlier mockery might have been premature, but most still looked skeptical, even confused. A sergeant major? In that uniform? It seemed impossible. Marcus Webb's smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a furrowed brow. Something about the colonel's tone had changed the atmosphere in the room, transforming what had seemed like a joke into something far more serious. William Kovach stood silently at the front, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his gaze moving slowly across the rows of cadets. His eyes were a pale blue, and when they made contact with individual cadets, several found themselves looking away, suddenly uncomfortable with their earlier judgment. Colonel Harris wasn't finished. She reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a small frame, holding it so the light caught the glass. "Before Sergeant Major Kovach shares his experiences with you, I want to show you something. Something that will help you understand why his uniform looks the way it does." She held up the frame. Inside was what appeared to be a photograph, but from the distance, most cadets couldn't make out the details. "This photograph," Colonel Harris said, her voice taking on a quality that demanded absolute attention. "It was taken 23 years ago in a place most Americans have never heard of. A place where Sergeant Major Kovach and 11 other soldiers found themselves cut off from their unit, surrounded, and facing odds that no military textbook would tell you could be survived." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the usual sounds of shuffling feet and adjusted stances had ceased. Brandon felt his stomach tighten. 23 years ago. That would make it. He did the quick math. 1996? What conflict had been happening then? His mind raced through his history courses, trying to remember. Colonel Harris set the frame down on the podium and instead gestured to the man beside her. "But I'm not going to tell you that story. Sergeant Major Kovach is going to tell you himself. And I want you to listen, really listen to every word. Because by the time he's finished, you'll understand that the condition of his uniform isn't a sign of disrespect or lack of standards." She paused, her eyes moving across each row of cadets with an intensity that made several of them swallow hard. "It's a badge of honor that none of you have come close to earning." Sergeant Major William Kovach stepped fully to the podium, his calloused hands gripping its edges. For a long moment, he simply looked out at the sea of young faces, each one now frozen in attention. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that they'd severely misjudged the situation. "Spring of 1996, Kovach began, his voice gravelly but clear, carrying easily across the silent hall. "I was 31 years old, leading a reconnaissance team in the Balkans. Most of you weren't even born yet," he paused. And Brandon noticed the man's jaw tighten slightly, as if the memories were physically difficult to access. The mission was supposed to be simple, emphasis on supposed to be. "We were tasked with monitoring a mountain pass near the Croatian border. gathering intelligence on troop movements. Standard recon work, 7 days max, then extraction. Our team consisted of 12 soldiers, all specialists in their fields. Communications expert, medic, 3 sharpshooters, engineers, and combat veterans who'd seen action in the Gulf. Kovac's pale blue eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the assembly hall, beyond the present moment entirely. We inserted via helicopter at 300 hours on April 14th. The chopper dropped us 3 kilometers from our observation point to avoid detection. The terrain was brutal, steep mountainsides covered in loose shale, dense forests that hadn't been logged in decades, and temperatures that dropped below freezing once the sun went down. Cadet Thompson, who'd made the earlier comment about desk generals, felt heat rising to his face. This was clearly not a man who'd spent his service career behind a desk. By dawn, we'd established our position in a cave system overlooking the pass. Perfect vantage point, natural cover, difficult to approach from any direction. Our communications officer, Corporal Ryan Jacobs, set up the satellite relay. Everything was functioning exactly as planned. Kovac's expression darkened. For about 18 hours. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The cadets leaned forward almost imperceptibly, drawn into the narrative despite themselves. At 2100 hours on our first night, Jacobs picked up unusual radio chatter. Not the regular military communications we'd been briefed to expect. These were encrypted channels, sophisticated equipment, and they were moving toward our position. Fast. Kovac shifted his weight, and Brandon noticed him unconsciously favor that left leg again. Turns out, our intelligence was outdated. The area we'd been dropped into wasn't just a monitoring zone. It had become a critical supply route for a paramilitary group operating in the region. And they didn't appreciate having American observers documenting their movements. Marcus Webb, standing in the front row, felt his earlier smirk seemed like a distant, shameful memory. He kept his eyes fixed on Kovac, barely breathing. We had 2 choices, Kovac continued. Abort the mission immediately and call for emergency extraction, or hunker down and hope they passed without detecting us. Command made the call. Stay hidden, maintain mission parameters. Extraction would proceed as scheduled in 6 days. A muscle twitched in Kovac's jaw. That decision cost us everything. The silence in the assembly hall was absolute. Even the ventilation system seemed to have quieted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. By midnight, we knew we'd been compromised. Jacobs intercepted communications, indicating they had tracking equipment, thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar, the works. Military-grade hardware that shouldn't have been in civilian hands. They knew Americans were in the area, and they were systematically searching every potential hiding spot in a 20-kilometer radius. Kovac's hands tightened on the podium. I made the call to move. We packed our gear in under 10 minutes and headed deeper into the mountains, away from the pass, away from our extraction point. The terrain got worse, steeper, more unstable. Specialist Maria Cortez, our medic, nearly went over a cliff edge when the ground gave way beneath her. Sergeant Tim Bradford caught her by the pack straps with about 3 feet to spare. Jessica Brennan found herself holding her breath. Her earlier comment about Halloween costumes echoing shamefully in her mind. We moved through the night, trying to put distance between us and the search teams. But they had numbers, local knowledge, and equipment we couldn't match. By dawn on day 2, we could hear vehicles in the valleys below us. See search parties with dogs working the lower elevations. Kovac paused, reaching up to touch his left shoulder, the same shoulder where his uniform bore that crude, mismatched stitching. That's when the weather turned. Mountain storms in the Balkans don't mess around. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 2 hours. Rain came down so hard you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. Under normal circumstances, that would be bad news. For us being hunted, it was a gift. The rain washed away our tracks, grounded their helicopters, made the thermal imaging worthless. A slight, grim smile crossed Kovac's weathered face. We used that storm to disappear, pushed deeper into terrain so rough that no sane person would follow. Found ourselves in an area of the mountains that wasn't even properly mapped. Old-growth forest, ravines that hadn't seen human traffic in generations, caves that went back hundreds of feet into solid rock. He stopped, took a slow breath. That's where we spent the next 19 days. A collective intake of breath rippled through the cadet formation. 19 days? The mission had been scheduled for 7. Command couldn't reach us. The storm had damaged our satellite relay, and the terrain blocked everything else. We couldn't reach them. As far as the military knew, we'd gone dark in hostile territory, with enemy forces actively hunting us. As far as we knew, no one was coming. Kovac's voice remained steady. But Brandon could see the emotional weight behind each word. The way the man's shoulders carried tension that had nothing to do with physical posture. We had 7 days of rations, 7 days of water purification tablets, basic medical supplies for minor injuries. We were equipped for a week-long observation mission, not for 3 weeks of survival in hostile wilderness while evading enemy combatants. Cadet Webb felt his mouth go dry. The mathematics of that situation were brutal and simple. Corporal Jacobs worked on the communications equipment every spare moment, trying to jury-rig something, anything that would get a signal out. Specialist Cortez rationed our medical supplies, like every bandage was made of gold. The rest of us took turns on watch, moving camp every other day to avoid detection, and trying to stay warm in temperatures that regularly dropped below freezing at night. Kovac's hand moved to his chest, fingers brushing over an area of his uniform where the fabric looked particularly faded and worn. By day 5, we'd stretched our rations as far as they could go, started supplementing with whatever the forest could provide: berries, edible plants, one deer that Sergeant Luis Martinez managed to take down with a single shot at 200 yards. We couldn't risk a fire most nights, so we ate a lot of things raw that probably shouldn't be eaten raw. A few cadets grimaced involuntarily. By day 10, 2 of our team were showing signs of hypothermia. Cortez was doing everything she could, but medical training only goes so far when you're in the field without proper equipment or shelter. Bradford had developed a deep cough that worried all of us. Pneumonia in those conditions would be a death sentence. Kovac's eyes swept across the cadets again, and this time Brandon noticed something he hadn't seen before: a deep, bone-weary sadness that no amount of military bearing could completely hide. By day 14, we knew that if we didn't make contact soon, we weren't all making it out. Jacobs finally got the equipment working, sort of. He could transmit for about 30 seconds at a time before the battery died. Then we'd have to hand crank it for 3 hours to build up enough charge for another transmission. We had no idea if anyone was receiving it. The sergeant major's voice dropped lower, forcing the cadets to strain slightly to hear. On day 16, they found us again. The assembly hall had grown colder, or perhaps it just felt that way. Sergeant Major Kovac's words hung in the air like a physical presence, and every cadet stood motionless, waiting for what came next. We'd made camp in a narrow ravine, Kovac continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. Steep walls on both sides, only 2 ways in or out. Tactically, it was a mistake, limited escape routes. But we'd been moving for 16 days straight, and Bradford's condition had worsened. He needed rest, real rest, and this spot offered shelter from the wind and concealment from aerial observation. He paused, his fingers drumming once against the podium, a brief break in his otherwise rigid composure. I took first watch that night. 200 hours I heard it, the crack of a branch, too heavy to be an animal. Then voices, low and cautious, speaking a language I didn't need to understand to know what it meant. They'd picked up our trail somehow, maybe from the deer Martinez had shot 3 days earlier, maybe just dumb luck. Brandon felt his pulse quicken. He'd trained in tactical scenarios, run simulations, practiced quick reaction drills. But those had always been exercises with instructors watching, with the knowledge that mistakes meant failed grades, not failed lives, I woke the team without a sound. Hand signals we drilled 1,000 times. 6 seconds and everyone was up, weapons ready, gear packed. But we had a problem. Bradford couldn't move quietly anymore, not with that cough. Every breath sounded like a freight train in the silent forest. Kovac's jaw clenched. Martinez and I made the call. We'd create a diversion, draw them away from the main group, while the others moved Bradford to a fallback position 2 kilometers west. Jacobs argued, said we should stick together, but the math was simple. 12 of us trying to move silently with a sick man. We'd all be caught. 2 of us making noise in the opposite direction. Maybe we'd buy enough time. Cadet Thompson felt a cold understanding settling over him. This wasn't a heroic charge or a dramatic firefight from the movies. This was mathematics, terrible mathematics, where human lives were the variables. Martinez and I took off east, making just enough noise to be tracked, but not so much that it seemed obvious. We left markers, broken branches, disturbed ground, a dropped energy bar wrapper. Led them on a chase through terrain that would slow them down, by the others' hours instead of minutes. Kovac's hand moved unconsciously to his left leg, to the source of that persistent limp. It worked. Too well, actually. By dawn, we'd drawn off what we thought was their main search party. 8 men, all armed, all equipped with night vision and radios. We managed to stay ahead of them through sheer knowledge of the terrain and the fact that they were following our trail, instead of cutting us off. He stopped, and for the first time, something like dark humor crossed his features. Then Martinez stepped into a hunter's trap, old Soviet-era design, meant for large game. Steel jaws snapped shut on his right foot. I heard the bones break from 10 feet away. Several cadets flinched visibly. Jessica felt her stomach turn. The men chasing us heard it too. Heard Martinez try to choke back a scream and not quite succeed. They started closing in fast, and I had maybe 90 seconds to make a decision. Kovac's voice remained level, but Brandon could see the cost of these memories in the tightness around the man's eyes. I could leave Martinez, complete the diversion, maybe buy the team a few more hours. Or I could stay, try to free him from the trap, and likely get us both killed or captured. Neither option was in any manual I'd ever read. The silence stretched. Colonel Harris stood to the side, her expression unreadable but her attention absolute. I stayed, used my knife to pry open the trap, while Martinez bit down on his belt to keep from screaming. Got his foot free just as the first of our pursuers came into visual range, maybe 40 meters out. Moving through the trees, Kovac touched his shoulder again. That place where the stitching looked so crude and mismatched. Martinez couldn't walk. I got him up, got his arm around my shoulders, and we moved. Not fast, not quiet, just moved. They opened fire, AK-47s, the sound echoing through the whole valley. First round caught me here, he indicated his left shoulder, went clean through. Second hit my pack, destroying what was left of our rations. Third hit Martinez in the left arm. The cadets were no longer just listening, they were transported, pulled into a mountain forest half a world away. Feeling the panic and desperation of that moment, we made it to a cliff edge, 15-foot drop into a stream below. I didn't think, didn't calculate, just jumped with Martinez still hanging onto me. Hit the water hard, cold enough to stop your heart. The current carried us downstream, fast and rough, smashing us against rocks. Kovac's breathing had changed slightly, the memories clearly affecting him despite the years of distance. I lost consciousness for a bit, don't know how long. Came to with Martinez dragging me onto a bank 200 meters downstream. He'd been shot, had a shattered foot, but he pulled my unconscious body out of that water and got us hidden in an overhang before the search party could reacquire us. Marcus Webb felt something shifting in his chest, a fundamental recalibration of what strength and courage actually looked like. It had nothing to do with perfect uniforms or polished boots. We stayed hidden for 6 hours while they searched. Could hear them moving along the banks, calling to each other, systematic and thorough. Martinez had tourniqueted both our wounds with strips torn from his uniform. That's where this sleeve damage started. Kovac gestured to the tear in his own uniform, and why his shirt looked like it had been through a shredder. He paused, took a breath. When they finally moved on, we assessed the damage. I'd lost a lot of blood from the shoulder wound. Martinez's foot was destroyed. Even if we'd had a fully equipped hospital, he was looking at permanent disability. We had no medical supplies, no food, no communication equipment. And we were at least 15 kilometers from where the rest of our team was supposed to be. The mathematical bleakness of the situation settled over the assembly hall like a physical weight. Martinez looked at me and said, "Well, Sergeant, at least it can't get any worse." And that's when the infection started. Kovac's expression hardened. Within 12 hours, both our wounds were showing signs of sepsis. No antibiotics, no sterile dressings, just mountain water and cloth torn from uniforms that had been worn for over 2 weeks straight. We developed fevers that made us delirious. I have memories from the next 3 days that I'm still not sure are real. Hallucinations mixing with reality until you can't tell which is which. Specialist Brennan, who'd made that comment about Halloween stores, felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back, but the shame remained. We crawled. That's not an exaggeration or dramatic language. We literally crawled through that forest for 3 days. Martinez's foot couldn't bear weight, and my shoulder had seized up to the point where I couldn't use my left arm. We moved maybe 2 kilometers a day, hiding during daylight, moving at night, drinking from streams and eating nothing because we couldn't catch or gather anything in our condition. Kovac's hand trembled slightly as he gripped the podium tighter. On the 19th day, we heard the helicopters, American Black Hawks flying a search pattern. Jacobs had gotten through. Our team had made it to an extraction point, and now they were searching for the 2 idiots who'd run off to play hero. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Bitter and tired, Martinez and I were in a small clearing. We tried to signal, but we were too weak to do much more than wave our arms. The helicopters passed right over us twice. We thought we'd been missed, that we'd die within sight of rescue. He stopped, his pale blue eyes sweeping across every face in the assembly. Then one of the crew chiefs saw something, later told me it was the sun reflecting off Martinez's watch. They circled back, dropped a line, and pulled us out. Got us to a field hospital within the hour. The relief that should have accompanied this rescue didn't materialize on Kovac's face. Instead, his expression grew harder, more closed off. Martinez lost his foot. The surgeons did what they could, but 3 days of infection and that initial trauma, there was nothing to save. He was medically discharged 8 months later with a Purple Heart and a disability rating that meant he'd never serve again. Kovac's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He was 24 years old. The weight of that final statement, he was 24 years old, hung in the air like smoke. Sergeant Major Kovac stood silent for a moment, letting the reality of Martinez's sacrifice settle over the cadets. Brandon felt something twist in his chest, imagining being that age, losing a limb, watching a military career end before it had barely begun. The rest of the team made it out, Kovac continued, his voice regaining some of its steadiness. Jacobs got his communication rig working long enough to transmit our coordinates. Bradford recovered after 2 weeks in a German hospital. Turned out he had walking pneumonia and 2 cracked ribs we didn't even know about. Cortez received a commendation for her field medicine work that kept all of us functional long enough to survive. He shifted his weight again, and now every cadet understood the source of that limp. Not age, not carelessness, but a bullet that had torn through his shoulder and the subsequent infection that had ravaged his system. I spent 3 weeks in medical care myself. The shoulder wound had damaged nerves, required 2 surgeries to repair. Even then, I lost about 30% mobility in my left arm. The infection had spread to my bloodstream, septicemia, the doctors called it. They said if we'd been out there another 24 hours, I would have died. Colonel Harris shifted slightly, her expression revealing something the cadets had never seen before, deep respect tinged with sadness. When I was finally cleared to return to duty, they offered me a medical discharge. Honorable, full benefits, no questions asked. The shoulder damage meant I couldn't meet the physical standards for frontline deployment anymore. I was 31, had already served 10 years, had a Purple Heart and enough commendations to justify an easy transition to civilian life. Kovac's jaw tightened. I refused. Told them I didn't care if I couldn't carry a 70-pound pack anymore or do pull-ups with my left arm. I'd find another way to serve. They reassigned me to training command, figured I could teach new recruits without needing full physical capacity. Cadet Thompson felt a sudden rush of understanding. This man hadn't chosen a desk job to avoid danger. He'd been forced into it by wounds earned saving a fellow soldier's life. I've spent the last 23 years training soldiers, Kovac said, his pale blue eyes sweeping across the formation. Thousands of young men and women have passed through my programs. I've taught hand-to-hand combat from a wheelchair during my recovery periods. I've run tactical drills while unable to raise my left arm above shoulder height. I've instructed survival courses while walking with a cane. He paused, and something fierce entered his expression. And I've worn this uniform the entire time. Brandon's eyes dropped to that torn, faded, stained fabric, and suddenly it looked completely different. Not shabby or disgraceful, but sacred. A relic from a battle that most people would never know happened. This isn't the uniform I wore on that mission, Kovac clarified. That one was so destroyed by the end that they had to cut it off me in the hospital. This is a replica I had made 6 months after I returned to duty. Had it treated to look aged, had the same repairs made in the same places, even had the stains recreated as close as possible. Several cadets exchanged confused glances. Why would someone deliberately make their uniform look damaged? Kovac seemed to anticipate the question. I wear it on specific occasions. Not every day. That would violate regulations I still respect. But when I speak to new trainees, when I address graduating classes, when I visit schools and youth programs, I wear this uniform. And do you know why? The question hung in the air, rhetorical but demanding an answer nonetheless, because every tear, every stain, every missing button tells a story that needs to be told. This shoulder, he touched the crude stitching, reminds me of Martinez tearing his own uniform to tourniquet my wound while he was bleeding himself. These stains, his hand moved to the discolored patches on the chest, are from 3 days of fever sweat while crawling through a forest, praying for rescue. These missing buttons were lost in a river that nearly drowned me, but ultimately saved my life. Marcus Webb felt his throat tighten. His earlier mockery seemed not just inappropriate now, but obscene, a desecration of something he hadn't understood. Every time someone looks at this uniform and judges it, Kovac continued, his voice hardening. Every time someone sees the damage and thinks I'm disrespecting the service, I know exactly what they're revealing about themselves. They're showing me that they value appearance over substance. They're demonstrating that they've never been in a situation where survival mattered more than regulations. They're proving that they don't understand what military service actually costs. Colonel Harris stepped forward slightly, her expression stern as she looked out at her cadets. When I invited Sergeant Major Kovac to speak today, she said, her voice cutting through the space, I knew exactly what would happen. I knew you would see his uniform and judge him. I knew you would whisper and smirk and feel superior because your creases are sharp and your buttons are polished. Several cadets had the grace to look ashamed. Brandon felt heat rising in his face. I let it happen, Harris continued, because you needed to learn this lesson, not from a lecture or a manual, but from experience. You needed to feel the shame of realizing you'd mocked a man who has sacrificed more for this country than any of you have yet had the opportunity to give. The words landed like physical blows. Jessica Brennan felt tears streaming down her face now, making no effort to hide them. You are being trained to be officers, Harris said. Leaders. That means you will be responsible for the lives of the men and women under your command. And if you cannot look past a torn uniform to see the character and courage beneath it, then you have no business leading anyone into any situation where their lives might depend on your judgment. Kovac raised his hand slightly, a gentle gesture that drew Harris's attention. She nodded and stepped back, returning the floor to him. I don't tell you this story to make you feel guilty, Kovac said, his tone softening marginally.
Guilt is useless.
I tell you this story so you'll understand something fundamental about military service that no classroom can teach you. He gestured down at his uniform. This isn't about me. It's not about my mission or my wounds or my career. It's about understanding that the measure of a soldier, the true measure, has nothing to do with how they look on a parade ground. It's about what they do when everything goes wrong, when the mission falls apart, when the only choice left is between terrible options and worse ones. Brandon found himself nodding involuntarily, the lessons sinking in at a level deeper than intellectual understanding. Some of you will serve full careers and never face a situation like the one I've described, Kovac continued. I hope that's true for all of you, honestly. But some of you will find yourselves in places where the training breaks down, where the manual doesn't have an answer, where you have to make impossible choices with incomplete information and live with the consequences. His hand moved to his chest, fingers brushing over a spot the cadets hadn't paid much attention to before, a small rectangular patch above the pocket, faded and worn but still visible. When that happens, Kovac said quietly, you won't be thinking about uniform regulations or what people back home might think of you. You'll be thinking about the soldiers depending on you, about getting your people home alive, about doing the mission even when the cost is higher than anyone should have to pay. He tapped the patch with one finger. This is what Colonel Harris wanted you to see. This is what matters more than all the pressed uniforms and polished boots in the world. Colonel Harris reached into her pocket again and pulled out that photograph she'd mentioned earlier, the one taken 23 years ago. She held it up, and this time using a small projector that had been set up at the side of the room. The image appeared on the screen behind the podium. 12 soldiers, filthy and exhausted, standing in front of a Black Hawk helicopter. Their uniforms were destroyed, torn, stained, barely recognizable as military issue. Several were bandaged. One was on a stretcher. But on every chest, clearly visible even through the damage and dirt, was the same small rectangular patch that Kovac wore now. This patch, Colonel Harris said, her voice filled with quiet intensity, is authorized only for soldiers who have completed missions under the most extreme circumstances. It's not something you can earn through normal channels. It's not awarded for completing training or serving a tour. It's given to those who have faced impossible situations and found a way to survive, to complete the mission, to bring their people home against odds that should have killed them. She paused, letting the cadets study the photograph. In the 23 years since that mission, this patch has been awarded exactly 17 times. The number hung in the air, 17. In 23 years across all branches of the military, through conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and countless classified operations most civilians would never hear about. Only 17 soldiers had earned this patch. Sergeant Major Kovac stepped closer to the edge of the platform, and for the first time the cadets could see the patch clearly. It was deceptively simple. A dark blue background with a silver eagle, wings spread, carrying what looked like a broken chain in its talons. Below it, a single word in Latin, adversitas. Adversity, Cadet Thompson whispered to himself, translating automatically. The patch has no official name in military records, Colonel Harris explained, her voice carrying a reverence the cadets had never heard from her before. Informally, it's called the Sentinel's Badge. It represents soldiers who held the line when the line should have broken, who protected their teams when protection seemed impossible, who made the hard choices and lived with the consequences. She gestured to Kovac, who stood motionless, his weathered face unreadable. Sergeant Major Kovac earned his patch not for surviving 19 days in hostile territory, though that alone would be remarkable. Not for being wounded in combat, though his injuries were severe. He earned it for the choice he made when Luis Martinez stepped into that trap. Brandon felt his breath catch. That moment, the 90 seconds Kovac had to decide between completing the mission or saving his teammate. Military protocol in that situation is clear, Harris continued. The mission takes priority. One soldier's injury cannot compromise the safety of the entire team. Kovach's tactical training, his duty to the other 10 soldiers, depending on that diversion. Everything in his background told him to leave Martinez and complete the objective. The assembly hall was so quiet that the ventilation system sounded like thunder. He stayed anyway. He pried open that trap with his bare hands while enemy combatants closed in. He carried a wounded soldier through enemy fire, took a bullet meant for both of them, and jumped off a cliff into freezing water rather than leave Martinez behind. And when he woke up on that riverbank, injured and bleeding, his first action was to check on Martinez's condition before his own. Kovach's expression flickered, just for a moment, revealing the emotional weight he still carried from that day. The men who were hunting them gave up the search after 6 hours, Harris said. They assumed no one could have survived that fall into the rapids. But Kovach and Martinez did survive, and they crawled 15 kilometers through infected wounds and delirium to reach a position where they could be rescued. Every meter of that distance, Kovach could have moved faster alone. Every hour, he could have improved his own survival odds by leaving his wounded teammate behind. She paused, her eyes sweeping across every cadet. He never considered it. Not once. Marcus Webb felt something breaking apart inside his chest. All his assumptions about what made a soldier great, all his focus on physical performance and technical skill, suddenly revealed as superficial and incomplete. After their rescue, Harris continued, Kovach's commanding officer recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation was reviewed, debated, and ultimately declined, not because his actions didn't merit it, but because the mission itself was classified at a level that prevented public recognition. A ripple of anger moved through some of the cadets. How could such courage go unrecognized? Instead, Harris said, he was awarded the Sentinel's badge in a private ceremony attended only by his immediate chain of command and the 11 soldiers he'd served with in those mountains. No media coverage, no public record, no glory. Just a small patch, and the knowledge that 12 people went into those mountains and 12 people came home alive. Kovach finally spoke again, his gravelly voice somehow gentler than before. Martinez is here today, he said simply. A door at the side of the assembly hall opened and a man in a wheelchair rolled through. He was younger than Kovach, late 40s, with dark hair graying at the temples and a warm smile that transformed his face. He wore a suit perfectly tailored and moved with practiced ease despite the obvious absence of his right leg below the knee. The cadets watched in stunned silence as Martinez wheeled himself to the front of the hall, parking his chair beside Kovach. The two men exchanged a look that contained decades of shared history, trauma, brotherhood, and something that transcended words. Luis Martinez, Kovach said, gesturing to his former teammate, 24 years old when he lost his foot. Medically discharged 9 months later. Currently serves as the Deputy Director of Veterans Affairs for the entire northeastern region, overseeing support programs for over 40,000 disabled veterans. Martinez smiled, that same warmth radiating outward. I'm also, Martinez added, his voice strong and clear, the reason Bill wears that ridiculous uniform to these events. A surprised laugh escaped from several cadets before they could stop it. The tension in the room broke slightly, though the reverence remained. See, Bill got it in his head that he needed to honor what happened in those mountains, Martinez continued, his tone conversational but his eyes serious. He had this uniform made, wanted it to look exactly like what we wore when we got pulled out. Spent months getting every detail right, and when he first showed it to me, I told him he looked like he'd raided a disaster relief donation bin. Kovach's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. But then I understood what he was doing, Martinez said, his voice quieting. Every time Bill wears this uniform, someone judges him. Someone looks at the tears and the stains and the missing buttons and decides he's lazy or disrespectful or doesn't understand military standards. Someone makes the same mistake you all made this morning. The cadets who had whispered insults earlier felt their shame intensify. And every single time, Martinez continued, Bill lets them judge, lets them reveal who they are and what they value. Then he tells them our story, shows them this patch, and teaches them the same lesson you're learning right now. He wheeled closer to the front row of cadets, his eyes moving across their young faces. I lost a foot in those mountains. Bill lost full use of his arm. Both of us carry scars you can't see. Nightmares, hypervigilance, all the things that come from 19 days of thinking every moment might be your last. But you know what we didn't lose? The question hung in the air. Each other. Bill gave up mission completion, risked a bullet, survived septic infection and hypothermia, all to make sure I came home. And every day since then, I've tried to live a life worthy of that sacrifice. Every veteran I help, every program I build, every policy I fight for, it's all because Bill Kovacs decided my life was worth the cost. Martinez's hand moved to his own chest, and the cadets saw it. The same patch, the same silver eagle, the same single word. Adversitas. We both wear the patch, Martinez said. But Bill's the one who earned it for both of us. My job was just to survive long enough to be worth saving. Kovacs shook his head slightly, a gesture of disagreement that spoke volumes about their friendship. Colonel Harris stepped forward again, her command presence reasserting itself. Cadets, you came into this hall this morning as students. You saw a man in a damaged uniform, and you judged him based on appearance. You mocked what you didn't understand, dismissed what you hadn't earned the right to evaluate. That's human nature, and it's not unforgivable. Her voice hardened. But you will leave this hall as something different. You will leave understanding that military service, real service, is measured not in pressed uniforms and parade ground performance, but in the choices made when everything falls apart. In the soldier who stays when leaving would be easier. In the leader who values their people's lives over their own advancement. In the courage to do the right thing, even when the cost is devastating. She gestured to both men standing before them. These two soldiers represent the standard you should aspire to. Not their injuries, not their suffering, but their commitment to each other and to the mission. Their willingness to sacrifice, their refusal to abandon their principles, even when those principles demanded terrible prices. Brandon felt tears on his own cheeks now, no longer caring who saw them. Around him, other cadets stood with similar expressions. Shame transformed into determination, mockery burned away by understanding. Some of you will earn decorations in your careers, Harris said. Some will rise to high rank. Some will serve quietly and competently for 20 years and retire with honor. All of those paths have value. But if even one of you faces a moment like Sergeant Major Kovacs faced in those mountains, and you make the choice he made, to put your soldiers above yourself, to do the hard right instead of the easy wrong, to live up to the oath you swore, then everything we've taught you here will have been worth it. She snapped to attention, her salute crisp and perfect. Every cadet in the hall followed instantly, 200 hands rising in unison. Kovacs and Martinez returned the salute. These two warriors who had paid in blood and bone for the right to wear that legendary patch. As the salute dropped, Kovacs spoke one final time, his voice carrying across the silent assembly. Your uniforms are perfect today. Keep them that way. There's honor in discipline and pride in appearance. But remember that someday, somewhere, one of you might find yourself in a situation where your uniform gets torn, where the mission matters more than your appearance, where the choice you make will define not just your career, but who you are as a human being. He touched the patch one last time. When that day comes, I hope you'll remember this morning. Remember that the measure of a soldier isn't in the thread count of their uniform, but in the strength of their character. Not in how they look during inspections, but in what they do when no one is watching except the people depending on them to make the right call. Martinez wheeled forward slightly, adding his own final thought. And I hope, he said quietly, that if any of you ever have to make the choice Bill made, you'll find the courage to do what he did. Because that's the choice that brings everyone home. That's the choice that earns a patch that can't be bought, traded, or awarded for anything except proving that when it mattered most, you refused to leave anyone behind. The assembly hall remained silent for a long moment after both men finished speaking. Then, without any command or signal, Cadet Marcus Webb began to clap. The sound started as a single pair of hands, then spread like wildfire through the formation. Within seconds, 200 cadets were applauding. The sound building until it echoed off the walls like thunder. Kovac and Martinez stood together, the veteran with his torn uniform and the man in the wheelchair, and accepted the recognition not as a reward, but as confirmation that the lesson had been learned. Colonel Harris let the applause continue for exactly 30 seconds before raising her hand. Silence fell immediately. "Dismissed," she said simply. As the cadets filed out, every single one of them stopped to shake both men's hands. Brandon gripped Kovac's weathered hand and found himself unable to speak, the apology he wanted to offer seeming inadequate. Kovac seemed to understand anyway, his slight nod conveying forgiveness that hadn't even needed to be asked for. Jessica Brennan approached Martinez, tears still streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she managed to say. "I didn't understand." "Now you do," Martinez replied gently. "That's what matters. That's why we're here." As the last cadets left the hall, Derek Thompson paused at the door and looked back. Kovac and Martinez stood together near the podium. Two men bound by a choice made in a mountain forest 23 years ago, still teaching lessons that no classroom could provide, still wearing their scars, visible and invisible, as reminders of what service truly costs. Thompson saluted one final time, though neither man could see him from that distance. Then he turned and walked out, carrying with him a lesson he would never forget, that the most legendary warriors aren't always the ones with the most medals or the highest ranks. Sometimes they're the ones with torn uniforms and patches that tell stories most people will never fully understand, but the cadets of Fort Bennet Military Academy understood now, and they would carry that understanding with them for the rest of their lives. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.